Well, hello, folks. Welcome to The Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price. I'm your host, and today I've got a fantastic interview participant, Miriam Volat, and I want to talk a little bit about her, go into some details, housekeeping on the podcast, and then jump into the interview. First and foremost, I would like to read her bio. So if I could get over here to it. Miriam Volat, co-director of RiverStyx Foundation and Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, Executive Director of IPCI, is an educator, organizer, facilitator, and ecologist with a passion for soils and nutrient cycles. She works nationally and internationally to increase health in all systems. She's dedicated to the biocultural conservation of peyote and other sacred medicines, supported by the IMC Fund, and works in any way she can to ensure the conservation of these medicines for indigenous communities and their precious ways of life. As a mom, she's fortunate. Her daughter, Cora, also supports her work. Check her out at the RiverStyx Foundation, links below, imc.fund and ipci.life. So Miriam, thanks for participating. Thank you for doing what you do. That was a fantastic conversation to have, and I'm eager to introduce it to you, the listener, and the viewer. I also want to talk a little bit about RiverStyx, just reading from their website, RiverStyx Foundation. The RiverStyx Foundation is a philanthropic organization that strives to work at this boundary place through grant-making and seeding nonprofits. RiverStyx attends to the places in society and our psychology which have been relegated to the shadow out of fear, ignorance, and Puritan influence. Recognizing that which is repressed only festers and breeds pathology and its unnatural separation. In so doing, may we come into greater balance, beauty, and belonging. So thanks to RiverStyx Foundation, I had a wonderful time at the Parliament of World Religions, hanging out with all you guys. What a great crew. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. Okay, onward. I also have another bit of gratitude for Hunt Priest. Check out episode 94 with Hunt Priest and Jessica Felix Romero, where we talk about Ligare, and I really have Hunt to thank for connecting me with Miriam. So thanks, Hunt. Just a couple notes. I want to shout out to the Young Houston, J-U-N-G, Houston.org. I love all that they are doing. Disclaimer, I'm on the board over there, so I'm a pretty big advocate of the work they do. I want to thank Modern Nations and direct you to the track that's at the end of the episode with this amazing song that's been the theme song called Clouds. Thanks, guys, in Modern Nations. And for the Center for Healing Arts and Sciences, this is a boutique integrative wellness center that my wife and I started many years ago. And we are the sponsors of this podcast. That's, quite frankly, the reason why this podcast exists in the way that it does. It's because of the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences. So check it out at thecenterforhas.com. Again, links below. And a question to contemplate through this episode. I'm very curious. I've got a couple of books and interviews that are coming up on this subject, but culture. I want to explore culture, and I'm certainly thinking about how culture can become sick, and in what ways the culture, the overlay of the culture onto the individual, can corrupt and distort the fluid expression of that individual. And in the kind of Jungian psychoanalytic world, we talk about adaptations. So adaptations that we make through our individual developmental lives. The idea here is that we do that also culturally. We try to fit into a culture, and the culture might not be the right fit. So I want to explore this in depth and go over to the Instagram page for The Sacred Speaks and post any comments or thoughts, or send me a message over there about your thoughts about culture and being sick. Any recommendations that you got as far as reading is concerned. It's a subject I really want to dig into. Okay, for now, check out The Sacred Speaks at thesacredspeaks.com. And other than that, I think that's all. So for now, we'll leave it there. Thanks for joining us. And be sure to share the episode and post about it and like everything that's out there. Much appreciated. For now, we'll leave it there. Miriam, thanks for joining. We have a lot of different intersections, and I know a good deal of people who speak very highly of you and your work. I was able to see at least Cody. I saw Cody present at MAPS, but I had so many other things. It was kind of wild. So I'm looking forward to meeting you at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago soon. And thanks for joining here today. We're going to talk a lot about some material that has, of course, been represented in this podcast, but so much that hasn't. So your voice, as we were talking earlier, getting acquainted, your voice speaking for traditional cultures, traditional medicine, ceremony, and I think that larger question of culture and this major question of what we're looking at on how do we introduce these radically destabilizing compounds to our religion and spiritual culture here in certainly in the United States, but in the West. So I'm happy to have you here, and I'd love to start with just who you are and what brought you into using your voice to speak for so many who aren't included at the table.
Well, thank you, John. It's good to be here with you and see those mountains behind you. Beautiful.
Yeah, thanks.
So I'm the co-director of the RiverStyx Foundation, and RiverStyx Foundation, we have an interesting way of tracking our mission, but the core of what we do is things that have been stigmatized by society or marginalized in ways or kept down, that are now being worked with in a way that really brings more balance, health, healing, homeostasis. We're there to support those things moving forward into society and into culture in a good way. And so that's sort of our rubric. And for me, I have a background in studying ecology and soil science, and I worked for many years doing multi-stakeholder work and community education around sustainable regenerative agriculture and water issues and climate issues. I even spent some time doing climate action plan work for the state of California on different ag industries like dairy and things like that. And so my work with RiverStyx now, where I focus not exclusively, but a lot on supporting the conservation of traditional knowledge holding Indigenous communities in the face of kind of this psychedelic boom that's happening, really comes out of doing a lot of work for protecting our environment and our ecosystems. And I believe those things are deeply connected.
Mm-hmm. Well, talk to me about that because I read that about soil conservation and I see it. We just had somebody in our clinical practice, we had somebody come out that runs a farm just outside of town. And she said she started working as a farmer to grow organic fruits and vegetables. And very quickly she realized that she was not a farmer of fruits and vegetables, that she was a farmer of soil. And I thought that was a great metaphor too. You know, the soil that we tend to and how often we go right to the fruit. And so I'm wondering how we can kind of paint that picture about, because I'm very curious about how the entheogens got your attention in the world of ecology and traditional medicine and the like.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, along with supporting traditional knowledge holding communities to have their own medicine sovereignty and their own ability to protect their cultural knowledge, which cannot be separated from their territories and the places that they live. We also support religious professionals that come from more Western traditions in connecting with these medicines. And the connection there is this, there's some kind of a relationship between a direct experience of the divine or of the sacred that that we hope these medicines can provide for many, many people, there's a direct relationship between that and I think what, taking care of our food and our water can do. If we have a direct connection to where our food comes from and the way that that takes care of our body and the way that we can feed ourselves and nourish ourselves without harming the environments and the territories that we live in. For me, those things are very related. Do we know where our food comes from? Do we know where our medicine comes from? Do we, in taking our food into our bodies and taking medicine into our bodies, are we becoming more, directly connected with the source of divinity, with the source of life, those kind of things? And so for me, it's a very natural trajectory to be committed to supporting communities to really be engaged and involved with food and soil and where life comes from, to be engaged in supporting communities to be directly connected and understand the context in which they would be taking medicines that are more consciousness medicines or spiritual medicines or as well.
Well, I really want to take advantage of having you here and pretend that I am an alien that doesn't know any of these issues, and I don't know what's going on in these common, Western and traditional and medicine. And so could you just kind of lay out the problem as you see it and am I using the correct language? I tend to say Westerner. I know that's a shorthand that doesn't quite get to what we're talking about, but again, I'm an alien. Help me understand what's going on in this current world of indigenous traditional medicine and Western medicine, reductionist medicine, maybe we could call it that.
Well, I think my understanding, which is limited, is that mainstream culture and the place where we are now, and there's a lot of reasons for this, right, is fairly disconnected from a lot of things. We're disconnected from each other. We're disconnected from healthy community processes. We're disconnected from the earth. We're disconnected from sort of cultural and containers for helping us really know, who we are and find meaning in our lives. Mm-hmm. And, I think they're all over the news all the time are all these examples of the ways that we're disconnected. And we talk about and we read about that we have this mental health crisis right now, that there's a lot of suicidality, there's a lot of depression, there's a lot of anxiety. People have trauma that they don't have methodologies in their families or communities for overcoming. And this psychedelic boom is really kind of happening at this moment when there's a lot of interest and it's a primary concern to address this mental health crisis, right? And underpinning that mental health crisis, we hear things about disconnection, but my understanding is that that disconnection at the root of it is just from nature and where we live, and kind of, for lack of a better phrase, like lifing. We're a little bit disconnected from just, kind of the, wonder, enjoyment, beauty, and also really practical ways that we can connect with nature, each other, and life. And, we could say that's because there's over 8 billion people and urbanization and all the industrial things and our the ways that our technology works and being connected to our phones instead of whatever. There's a lot of reasons for that. The history of some of our primary religions, which has maybe caused us to be disconnected from feeling like we're directly engaged with the divine or lifing or whatever you want to call it. And so I think, one of the really big risks of this like hunger and need and desire for connection, and then reaching out for finding that connection, and it's different for different people from these medicines. One of the risks that I particularly am concerned with is that it will just be another wave of colonial behavior, which will then negatively impact the people and then the territories that they live in, that have often been at the brunt of kind of colonial waves, like energy extraction or taking trees, or the way that agriculture is worked in the Amazon. And so I personally think one of the things we should be unequivocally the most committed to, I think it's actually one of the most important things with this psychedelic boom, is that we do whatever we can to ensure that the Western or mainstream search for connection and healing and health and, spiritual health and mental health does not become another wave of colonial kind of extractive behavior. And I feel like not only is that kind of, for lack of a better word, like a moral imperative, but it's also really important for the state that we're in right now, which is, we're in the sixth greatest extinction, which is the first, really human mediated extinction. We have biodiversity. We're losing species every day. We're all familiar with what's happening with climate change and the way that it's human mitigated. And a lot of these communities, which have their intact traditional knowledge, and also our medicine communities, live in the territories that are unequivocally the most important for mitigating how climate change is going to happen. Take the Amazon or the African jungle, for example. These are people whose knowledges are tied to the land where they are. And if they have increased pressure from the psychedelic boom, along with the oil extraction, the land rights issues, and all of that, then they're less and less able to take care of those places on the earth that we all need to be well taken care of. So for me, there's a connection between all of these things. And, my idealistic part believes that if the Western world can navigate the psychedelic boom to really provide more connection and healing without harming and causing further damage and pressure to those communities that we all need to be really healthy and strong, that's the only way that the psychedelic boom is going to be integrated in a truly healthful way into mainstream society, because otherwise it's going to be another damaging one to these really, really precious cultures.
So as I pay as I pay attention to my own mental health as you're talking about this, my anxiety, despite my the aspen trees blowing in the background, I'm freaking the fuck out. So
Sorry.
so I take my overwhelmment and I imagine what it's like to sit around at your conference table, at RiverStyx or any one of the other advocacy communities that you're involved in. And I feel I feel that sense of overwhelmment. I mean, because you're talking about, on some level, shifting the entire reality creating mode of I use the term Westerner and I corrected it into reductionist. And you said this term extractive behavior, which, let's really define this. We're talking about extracting the particular and not thinking about the whole. And
Right.
so in Western medicine, our imaging system does this. We say, okay, I've got an MRI and I can see that thing, but that thing is disconnected from the whole entire network of the human body and the human spirit and our interpersonal relationships. This deeply interconnected network that we're all a part of. And one of the ways that a more reductionist model proposes is that we identify the symptom, which is what we do in mental health. We
Mm-hmm.
identify the resource, which is what we do ecologically, and culturally we identify the process or the behavior and try to extract that. And so what I love that you're doing is you're integrating all these things together to say that you can go at them in any way, but you chose to really take this on by looking at traditional medicine traditional medicine ceremony in indigenous communities. Why is that the tip of the spear for you?
Mm. Because if this psychedelic boom can really, really address some of these diseases or that come from disconnection
Oh,
without harming um, and sort of perpetuating
mm,
another colonial wave, which we could probably extrapolate. The previous colonial waves are related to why we have that disconnection. I believe that if we can do that, it will lead to a much more complete and deeply integrated healing revolution, which is, I think, what we all, want this period of time to be. And so I think it's really, one of the ways that we're disconnected is we have a hard time thinking ahead way into the future and then
mm,
making our decisions based on having health in the future, whether it's for our grandchildren or other people's grandchildren or however, that works for us. So one of the questions that I think we're asking is 50 years from now, as we go into this psychedelic boom and we're creating it, and, before all the structures are in place for how it's, integrated into society, we still have some time. And we think, what is it that we want to see? What are the really important pieces that would be attended to? And, I think it sounds very simplistic, but for us, it seems unequivocally primary that we haven't caused more trauma than we've addressed.
mm,
And one of the places where we know there's already problems and traumas happening is at this interface of the Western search for how to integrate these things into society and Indigenous traditional knowledge holders. So, it makes a lot of sense that people would want to go to the people who have, thousands of years of knowledge in order to gain knowledge about how to do these things. But if you think about it, jumping right there is extractive, and it
mm,
doesn't take into account the context of history and things that have happened in the past. And so I think it's a really important question. How do we do that in a good way? How do we do that in right relationship? What needs to happen first? And what we've landed on that needs to happen first is in the next 10, 15, maybe 20 years, it's unequivocally important that traditional knowledge holding and territorial communities have what they need in terms of infrastructure, in terms of governance, in terms of knowledge about what's happening in the world, to know that they can protect their medicines and their communities and their culture into the future, and only from a place of them being very strong and intact and coming from their own cultural wisdom and having security in their homes, will they then be able to really meet this Western need as sort of strong in a strong place, and be able to help guide how that interaction should happen. Because a lot of times what we do is, like in a medical context, I won't tell you how many people I've talked to in a research context who are like, oh, well, we should just go get some of that knowledge about how the ceremonies work and we can put that into our clinical trial. I'm just like, oh my, and that's not somebody trying to be bad or mean. It's just jumping a lot of steps of how relationships work. And one of the things that I feel really grateful for in my life is having studied ecology. Ecology is a Western science that studies, it's the study of relationships between things. And so there's a way where studying ecology really trains you, oh, actually, the relationships between things are really, really important. So I think that this inquiry about what does a good relationship look like between, sort of a Western, whether it's like medical or lay person, attempt to develop some cultural norms around how to integrate these medicines. What does a good relationship look like with what you could call like sort of older siblings or aunts and uncles, like people who are further down the road on this? And probably it's not, hey, just give me what you have.
Well, it would first take there would first need to be an attitude of humility to recognize that the nature of scientism is that it's inherently incomplete. The model itself is about recognizing its incompleteness so that you can seek to study, and yet it then forgets that. And so on this note, because you've sat around with so many different traditional healers and indigenous folks, what's the diagnosis? Because let me fill in this blank. Most of the people that come into my office, they have symptoms, right? They come in because they're crying too much, or they're in the same relationship over and over again, or they've got anger issues, and all it's true, but also they feel stuck. They feel unable to respond. They feel empty. They feel unfulfilled. They feel almost like an existential malaise that even the vibrancy of life is they can't connect with it, and so they'll tend to find addictions. And certainly, our culture is quick to provide alcohol as a balm, for that. So I'm wondering if we flip it and we say, what do you hear from these indigenous leaders as far as a diagnosis is concerned? What I always want to look outside of myself and listen to people who are outside of my perspective, because they'll see things that I don't see. So what do you hear when you sit around those tables?
Well, one thing I hear that I think is really important for this conversation is that what is needed is for each of us to really find our own cultural lineages and connect with those things. And I think we actually started this conversation with you sharing a little bit about that, that you are wanting to, that it was really exciting to read the Immortality Key and realize that there was all this like knowledge and information there. And I think I hear that from a lot of different people in the territories. What if we were to all really lean into what there is of our own, kind of cultural lineages and get to know ourselves that way? I also think getting to know the place where you live. I mean, we're all, many of us are in these diasporas, even in, in Native American communities. They've been moved and they're in different places. And, one of the things we hear from a lot of the community leaders that are territorial, indigenous leaders that we're supporting is that the languages and the ceremonies and the ways you work with medicine are all tied to a place. The names things have are tied to a place and connected to those things. So if you just extract them and stick them somewhere else, they're kind of outside of the context of the root of what they're really connected to. And so even before I was doing this work, more doing agriculture or water conservation work, that is part of what you notice in communities, is that there's real meaning making by learning to take care of where you are, your home, your community, and then bringing in who you are in your own lineage. Not that you can't learn from other cultures and other people in other places. Obviously, that's how, we're in a global community at this point, but that there's a real power and a real need right now for people to do that. Actually, when we started as seed funders with the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, which I'm still the interim director of, although we're bringing on co-directors, and our first one is a Colombian Indigenous person, and it'll have leadership from territorial communities. But when we first were asked by several people we were supporting, several communities we were supporting, to create the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, that was one of the conversations, is that like for Westerners, what they really need right now is to connect as much as they can with their own cultures. And people really need to be learning their cultural traditions and the containers that they have. And everybody on the planet has some form of disconnection from their culture. We in the peyote work that we do, the language that we hear a lot from the elders is reconnection. That the conservation effort is a lot about reconnecting young people, old people, to the land, to the life cycle of their medicine, to traditional ways of giving offerings, to their own cultures, and to their languages, and really celebrating those things. And it's no different for, those of us who are part of the Western, diaspora, for a lack of a better word. And so that's something that I hear a lot. And then I think, I don't hear this language, but this is how I translate it into a short blurb, would be having good manners. So I remember my mom telling me, because I was a little bit rebellious, she'd be like, manners are about making the people that you're having dinner with comfortable. Yeah. So, if you're somewhere where people like eat with their hands and go like this, then that's good manners. And if you're somewhere where you want to make people comfortable, so what does it look like to have good manners with our neighbors and with other people who also want to have their cultures intact and have a beautiful future? And to me, that means you don't just go take, you find out what respect looks like to them. You engage with supporting without a need for getting something back from it first, in order to build trust. And then you go from there. And there's a lot of listening involved in that, right? Listening to, what will have this be a good relationship? We hear a lot about like reciprocity in this space in these days. Like, we want to get to reciprocity, but because of where we're at in history, there's a lot of things that have to happen before reciprocity can happen. There has to be some kind of reparations. There has to be honoring. There has to be respect. There has to be listening. and then you find your way to finding what's reciprocal.
It's so beautiful. It inspires a lot. And the first thing I feel, again, kicking this can down the road, is this is a disconnection from. It's a sadness and a desire. It's like a yearning to have a culture that feels rich. And
Yeah.
my cynical side kind of comes out here because I say this a lot to folks. I'm like, well, Buddhism does it, right? Buddhism says in the Four Noble Truths that, okay, we cling to things that are pleasurable and we avoid things that are uncomfortable. And
Mm-hmm.
I think in modernity, we certainly do that to an extreme because, I'm surrounded by all the technological advances that help creature comforts and connection, even our connection here, our ability to connect over a distance. But
Mm-hmm.
but I think that can't be the culture. I just feel so like disconnected from that lineage. And I noticed that my reading of Immortality Key and everything I've connected with since, on some level, has been an attempt to, what was it, Thumper in Bambi that looks around and go, are you my mommy?
Right.
Are you my daddy? Are
Totally.
you my mommy? Where are you? It's like we're looking for this community, I think, and we find it. And I think I want to go back to substance for a second because Jung said something very beautiful about alcohol. He said that alcoholics are spiritual people. They just found the wrong spirits,
Right.
and there's so much to unpack in that. So I imagine that I'm some kid that finds psilocybin from somebody in my high school, and I start doing it. I'm like, holy shit! Like, there's no way to
Yeah.
comprehend. Current day, you have the ability to find a community more, but when you
Mm-hmm.
don't have a ceremonial community that's saying, this is how you approach this with reverence. This is how you don't get overwhelmed by these radical divine experiences, which I can't even call it anything else. But these
Mm-hmm.
overwhelming experiences that shatter the boundaries and narratives of our ego and confront us with aspects of reality that are beyond our comprehension. I mean, I get it why we're looking in the West right now we're so concerned about what's happening with the psychedelic boom, because if you have that experience and no real home to experience it and no boundary lines to bump up against,
Mm-hmm.
number one, you've got to do it all your own, which, okay, I can get that, right? And I've largely done that in a lot of ways. This podcast is that. But number two, um, you're at risk of not finding that home and walking around pretty aimlessly with this experience that you have no way of orienting to. So I just threw some stuff out there. What comes up for you as I say all that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, um, I have just the same concerns, and I hear you completely. And I think there's not an easy answer and it's complicated. I think, what comes up for me then is like some really simple things. Even the conversation we were just having, I think is really, really important in this, like starting with kind of home base.
Yeah.
And actually I was talking with somebody recently about, could there be like a little cartoon series or something that, got and went out and was just about things like, if you're wanting to have an experience that's healing and connective and all of that, and you want to be able to integrate it into your life in a good way, some of the things you can do are, like what are the basics, like could you um you know share with people that having like a 5 minute meditation for the week ahead of time might be smart, or eating some good clean food for the week ahead and the week after, or some really basic somatic support things like remember to feel your feet, or track your parasympathetic responses, but in like really easy language. Like we were trying to grapple with what are these really simple things that are very, very universal, that aren't kind of extractive and grandiose, and also don't require like a huge, like, multi thousands of dollars, like medical research on
Right.
setting, that could get into the communities that just help you stay, with yourself and support good integration. What are the things that we do know and have culturally that are fairly universal, that could just start becoming really part of the normal narrative, about just like normal practices. So I think that's a lot of the work that has to happen right now, is for people to be really thinking about looking at sharing just some of these really basic, simple things,
Mhm.
you know?
What came up as you were talking is this. Again, I go back to oftentimes a person in the clinician's office in the modern West is seeking symptom reduction. It's on some level a narcissistic endeavor. Like I need to feel better. Like it's this kind of I change me. I need to be different. I don't mean that critically. I mean that like I understand it. Because when you're feeling
Yeah.
overwhelmed and uncomfortable and suicidal, you want that to stop. So I don't mean that in any dismissive way. But what I hear you saying is how often in more ecologically minded spiritual approaches or more indigenous or traditional approaches, that right relationship is emphasized. Is that fair to
Yeah.
say?
Absolutely.
And so
Absolutely.
and so you hear that like when you're in a more collectivist culture, you're trying to find out where you've been off in relationship to those that are networked with you. And what does this symptom mean in relationship to others that you're in relationship with, as opposed to let me get rid of this symptom because it's making me uncomfortable? I think both have to be true, but
Absolutely.
could we say that one diagnostic issue, if we're diagnosing Western modern culture, is that the set point thinks in terms of symptom reduction as opposed to healthy healing relationship with self, other, and nature?
I think that was very well said.
Fair to say?
And I think that brings us back to this piece of like, the incredible amount of, longing and grief that's in most of our lives from being disconnected, whether it's disconnected to our own culture, disconnected from our place, disconnected from our community, disconnected from having, really clear routes for having a meaningful life, whatever that is. I think, the starting place is around the really simple ways that you can connect. And whether, whatever the history is, we do all live somewhere, and we do all come from somewhere,
Mm.
and we are in some network of relationships. So I personally would agree with that's that has to be there. And I know, I mean, I have people with mental health issues in my family, and I have that, and there is a need for symptom relief
Yeah.
sometimes, because you can't even get to the place if you're
Yeah.
deeply depressed or really having real suicidality, of finding a place to connect. And sometimes you just need, some relief from the pain in order to find a first place to connect. And I think that's, I mean, I've seen that over and over, but I think it's really important on the personal level, the community level, the movement level. I don't know if we're really in a movement. That's why I call it, this boom, to really pay attention to where the places are that need good connection. And they're not always inside of a time when you like took some medicine, right?
Right.
It's everything around it. It's preparation,
Yeah.
it's integration, It's how we conduct business. One of the things that we have a lot of concern from the Indigenous communities that we support is around patents. The whole idea that you can own a molecule that was created by life and the earth and whatever your context is, like divinely, and then you're going to assign an ownership to it, which I had the really awesome good fortune of getting to support one of our partners in presenting to WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization. And he is a Dene ceremonial leader. And they asked him, so what do you think about intellectual property? And so he really thought about it through his cultural and personal mindset. And what he shared was, well, everything that is about how molecules are formed, which is about how the structures of our bodies are formed, or even the soils in different places, mountains versus valleys, all of that, all of the intellectual knowledge for how that works and how all the relationships between them are, that actually all belongs to nature. It all belongs to the earth. So there is no way that a human law supersedes the unequivocal reality that belongs to nature, meaning natural processes and the history of the earth and how different atoms have formed with each other. Like it's not possible to own that, even if you make a tweak on it or whatever. So and a lot of Indigenous communities are really concerned about this idea of patents and ownership of sacred medicines, which we know from our human history that ownership does not necessarily lead to good decision making.
Right.
In fact, it's sometimes the opposite.
Yeah.
Right. And so, anyways, that's what comes to my mind with this, where, it's really, really important that we not lose the connection between, we have an individual person with a mental health issue who's, really looking for connection. And if we're going to use these medicines to help that person connect, it has to be done in a context of relationships to other kinds of support. And some cultural containers. And whether we like it or not, the way we do business and the way we conduct how people get access to things is part of that relationship. Mm-hmm. So I know this maybe sounds a little bit far-fetched, but I think it's part of addressing a mental health and disconnection crisis, how we do business. And if we start saying that some particular company can own a medicine that is about deep health and healing and is a consciousness medicine, then we're not helping that individual person feel like they can lean into a more, connected, respectful world. And so sometimes I'm a little idealistic, but I hope that this psychedelic boom can take on things like that and draw those kinds of connections. Because if you're in a room with your iPads on and you're taking a psilocybin, even if it's a synthetic molecule, and there's no acknowledgement within the system that got it to you there of these other relationships, then we're doing the same thing we've done with industrial agriculture, where we're not acknowledging relationships. And then we get into situations where we have whole swaths of land that are not productive anymore and aren't full of fertility anymore, because we didn't pay attention along the way to making sure that we keep the relationship going between the microorganisms and when we're applying fertilizer and, all of these things. So, I think there's a lot to be learned by some of the lessons we've learned from, our history with agriculture to some of the things that we need to pay attention to within the psychedelic boom. And it's really hard and it's really overwhelming to talk about things like that because it's really complicated. And it seems like what would your ownership and patent process and your business process have to do with like an end user patient who's just trying to get over depression? What would the connection be? Well, how are we really going to forget again that depression and disconnection is related to all these different ways that we're culturally disconnected?
That's the thank you for all that, by the way. That's the link, is that it's frustrating to me on a clinical level to work with individuals and to consistently see that it's not the individual, it's the culture.
Yeah.
And how are you in relationship with that culture? And in what ways have you introjected a belief system or a worldview that might have been passed down to you simply because it existed within those who came before you, but isn't actually serving you in healthy, healing ways, yet you continue to double down on that because it's the only thing you've known. And that, to me, is why we need is as a modern Westerner, I sit around, I'm like, shit, the church is not doing it. Right, like it's not, and no offense, I mean, so many of my colleagues and friends are actively involved in the church, and they're the ones that I have these conversations with the most,
Mm.
because of the systemic issues in the church, the cultural dynamics that are, have been passed along in various traditions, in, we'll say, Christian traditions in particular, and so it feels a little sick that the individual is the one that's manifesting the symptom of the deeper cultural issue, that it
Mhm.
seems to me, and here's my idealistic projection, is that I idealize indigenous traditional communities in this way. And I
Mm.
say, oh my gosh, this community, collective, connected, I know there are problems there. There's shadow there too. And also, it certainly does reveal something that I think we're lacking in this Western culture, of the deeply connected, deeply present, to
Mm.
listen, to listen deeply, like to the microorganisms. How do you listen to microorganisms?
Mm.
Seems like a valid question. But it brought up something about kind of where you are in your life. I found myself, as you were talking a second ago, curious about what you're working on right now that's making you really excited and that's tapping into that idealism. And then also, what are you working on right now that's very concerning, that the lay people out there in the world who don't sit around the table with indigenous leaders, what do you want them to know? What's important?
Mm. Well, I ha- right now, I would say I have two disparate things that working on that are really exciting. Maybe three. I'll say three. And one actually is through RiverStyx, we support a couple different kinds of efforts of really ensuring that um, good cycles are in place in things that happen all the time. So we support compost toilets, for example,
I read that.
getting used. And so, and I feel like that's really important. That's something that every single person has to deal with their waste every single day. And we could actually, like, imagine if you had a quorum of people in the United States who didn't actually have to put that in clean water and
Mm,
actually got to turn it into something beautiful that will grow more food. And frankly, with the level of population that we have, we better figure this out. And
yeah.
so that, to me, super inspiring, super exciting. I think it's like a personal cultural thing that in the United States, not very many people get to have the experience of. Other places they do, that actually really helps you pay attention to just yourself and what you're contributing to. right? So, what am I contributing to today? And if you have a compost toilet, you get to know that you're contributing to the future fertility of some beautiful place.
I
So that's
saw
one thing.
I saw Patricia Arquette in a documentary, and she says this line of keep the poop in the loop was the line, and I loved it because again, this is not we don't exactly sit around talking about our waste, and I think that's sad because it's so important for us to ask that question of where where's my waste going? What do I
Where's
eat?
my waste going?
Basic.
And is it in a loop? Is it in a poop
Yeah.
loop
Yeah.
that will then come back to me and come back to,
Totally.
somebody getting it? So super excited about that. I feel like it's really, I mean, it sounds mundane. It's so mundane, right? But it actually has very high impact. And by the same token, we're really supporting composting of human bodies once they
Mm.
pass. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
we've supported through Recompose the like law changes so it can happen, and then the creation of these beautiful spaces. We've been doing that now almost 7 years, I
Wow.
think, with RiverStyx as a big commitment. And now those places have waiting lists. It's an incredible way of addressing the problems of cremation in urban
Yeah.
areas. Because if you're in the country, it's one thing, but in urban areas, you don't have, um, the option to be buried right in the ground. And so I'm super excited about that for the same reason. There's a way of just connecting the normal person to the cycles of the earth. And I feel
Mm.
like that's a very connecting piece. I'm sure it's not for everybody, but it's amazing how exciting and interested people are in getting to know that their bodies would actually be composted. Maybe they would go to a conservation forest that's for climate change
Mm.
mitigation, or maybe a meadow, or maybe it engenders these conversations of, oh, would I want to be decomposed by the same microorganisms that were in a meadow or a forest or a mountain? And it's just kind of very connecting. So I feel like those kinds of things are unequivocally important. And then, the religious professionals' work that
Mm.
about, or religious leaders' work, I think is really crucial, because it's really about reigniting and reinvigorating religious leaders' connection to their own faith
Yeah.
structures, and finding the more direct guidance within them and reconnecting them to a direct experience of the divine. And I think that can only be good culturally. I think that there's a lot of healing to be done with, especially within Christianity, about its historical impacts on certainly Indigenous people and on the earth. But it feels like some kind of direct connection is going to help with that, and also help reinvigorate those religions' capacity to be a support and a positive community influence, and a source of community regulation,
Mm.
and a better word. And then, of course, the third thing is really this Indigenous medicine conservation work. The ability, I mean, I just feel so honored that I get to be unequivocally committed to placing the needs and wants and direction of traditional communities as the strategic guide for how to ensure that they have everything they need to be able to weather the next 20, 50 years with their cultures and medicine traditions more intact and more strong than maybe they even were 15 years ago, for them to be able to continue that. And I feel like it's really important to just focus on those communities having what they need and want, and being the directors of what that looks like, And if there's some kind of exchange with the dominant culture at some point, that will come from right relationship. So those are the three things I feel really excited and honored to get to work on.
What I like about what we're talking about is that we're not talking about the experiences that people have when they take medicine. You know, these medicines. To me, it's so. I really appreciate the inclusive nature of the way you're talking about all these various issues. You know, we can talk about traditional medicine ceremony and very quickly connect composting toilets, which, you know, that's it's not that, you know, maybe that's that part of me that's like, how, I mean, I totally get it. And I empathize with people who are like, how the hell did you get there? You know, but it's, my projection is that the way we got there is that when you think in terms of those networks and those relationships with beyond your own experience, you have to think in terms of how you're showing up in relationship to food, water, earth, other, self, and just I'm just pretty moved by the wide range that you offer. Which so now going to the other side, which is what are the challenges that you're facing, any of the struggles?
Mm. Well, I think I have to think for a second.
Take your time. Yeah, take your time.
Well, I think that even though a lot of what we've been talking about in a way is going back to basics, I would say it's also a lot of change. And so anytime you're doing work that's about changing people's point of view, changing their behavior, changing, you know, economic or science structures, you know, anytime you're trying to change things, even if it seems to you like it's towards something more simple, that there's always pushback and there's always complications and there's always, you know, yeah, the process of change. Even again, like I said, if it seems to you like it's simple, has disruption of some kind in it. So, you know, so one of the things that RiverStyx does is when we feel like something's really, really important, we're a very small foundation, but we leverage what we do have to give, and we leverage the fact that we do very deep due diligence and deeply engaged relationships to raise other funds. And so one thing that's a challenge is always, you know, supporting other people to, like in the philanthropy space, for example, to see what we see as important and kind of leverage ourselves to be able to really put enough resources behind something that it can weather actually being a change that becomes really solid, right? And so when you're kind of out at some edges, there's always a challenge there. And when you're challenging kind of a status quo way of thinking. So sometimes for me personally, I'll just share, sometimes things just seem so obvious and I just want to get to work, but I have to learn how to like communicate, you know, from the beginning to the end and the rationale and slow down and do those kind of things. And then I think, you know, supporting Indigenous communities, there's a lot of challenge there because these are communities that have, you know, 5 centuries of a lot of direct trauma. A lot of it's intergenerational. And there's a lot of like politics and competition, and it's really delicate to start bringing support into some of these communities. It can be very disruptive. And so just having to be so careful all the time and kind of really slow down and make sure that there's a good balance within the communities, that the right people are directing you. It's really challenging, and it's straight and frankly, a lot of the anxiety that I carry is around misstepping those things and the fear that will do harm, um, uh, either unintentionally or something like that, in these communities that are so precious and already have so many pressures. And so we have one of our conservation, we call it our conservation committee members, in the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, because we have an ethic of do no harm, which is like a medical ethic. Sure. Who always says, well, we're going to do as little harm as we can, and there's going to be a few harms, and that's really I struggle with that a lot, and sometimes struggle with, like, we're being very brave by moving into the territory, but yeah, sometimes I just want to put on the brakes with certain things and wait until we really know a lot more. And yeah, so I struggle with, I personally struggle with that. And I think it's one of the big challenges is that these are already delicate, complicated communities. And so interface between sort of the Western mainstream psychedelic boom and these communities has to happen. Those voices need to be there because it impacts them. But even the interface, like, we just supported a group to come to MAPS, and they got to, we had Indigenous community leaders from Mazatec, from South America, from North America, and they got to say some of these really important things about respect, and about slowing down, and about patents, and they got to say those things themselves to that big explosion thing at MAPS. And but then they also get criticized by their own communities. Why are you talking to those people? Why are you there? Yeah. And so there's always like some risk to this exposure at this interface. And so that's really challenging to navigate in a good way, and support the people I'm supposed to be supporting with knowledge and information, and spaces to be that are direct, without also feeling like you're kind of harming something, or there's something a little dirty, or you wish you didn't have to have like an elder have to go into a space like that, or that's so foreign to them. Yeah, and then I think the other big challenges, which you kind of alluded to, is I think this personal longing and need, and the mental health crisis, and all of that. It's really hard to talk about when you have these personal crises. I just had a nephew who commit suicide recently, so I've really been really thinking a lot about this, like, how do you really communicate in a way that's understood, the connection between that individual and these larger processes and systems. I think sometimes in the public health arena, there's people who are good at talking about that. Like we learned through the obesity epidemic, it's not an individual who has just an individual who has obesity. You have to address that, but it's also our whole food system and what people have access to, and their economic situation, and all of that. So we do have ways of understanding the connection between the individual and these bigger structures, but that's a big challenge for me. I think especially in the psychedelic space, is communicating about how those things can move hand in hand. Yeah.
I wish your
There's
family
a lot of
healing.
worry in doing this work.
Hmm.
What's that?
I wish your family healing. I'm,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
I am consistently in family systems and spaces where losses like this reverberate through so many lives. So just sitting with that for a moment.
Yeah.
Um, but it goes to this broader issue about our mental health, and certainly, um, the experiences that I have heard of and been a part of with these sacraments and medicines and compounds that are used traditionally in indigenous contexts seem to point us toward the things that we don't want to look at in our conscious lives, like death,
Yeah.
like aging, like
Yeah.
the pain of our own existential terror of
Yeah.
being a finite being, for the time that we're here, and regardless of theology or metaphysics, just so. When I think about suicide, and what hurts me so much is that there is a part of me that wishes we did have the access to these compounds to work with the things that we usually don't talk about. We're certainly not confronted by.
Yeah.
It seems to work on like our disgust systems, the things that we resist and then we're caught by. So taking that thread, I'm curious about what you're seeing if we could just kind of compare a little bit, how indigenous communities tend to use these medicines versus how modern Western folks tend to use these medicines. What are you?
Well, where I'll start is from my seat as an ecologist.
Mm-hmm,
And I actually think this is really important. I don't know of any story in traditional medicine communities where people take more than they need.
mm-hmm,
In the last 15 years, for example, with Iboga, which
mm-hmm,
is, addressed countless individual, healing experiences from trauma in the vets community and other communities, opioid use disorder. It's incredible. In those 15 years, the iboga plant, Tabernathia iboga, is now almost impossible for traditional users to find. It is being exported because of poaching. The same people who are poaching elephant tusks are poaching iboga. And it is going to be gone if it isn't directly addressed in a really, really good way.
mm-hmm,
So that's where you're getting your healing from a place that is going to lead to the same kind of behavior that is probably why you needed the healing in the
mm-hmm,
first place. Okay. Toad, Zappo, right? Has gone in the last 6 years from being an incredibly abundant creature, sacred to the Yaqui as part of their creation story, to being probably, the data will be coming in this season, put on not just the threatened species list, but heading towards extinction. So I would say a primary difference is that traditional medicine communities take what they need for healing. They don't take a whole bunch of extra for commercial purposes. They
mm-hmm,
don't take a whole bunch of extra for fun, right? You take what you need. And so I personally think this is a part of it. I know that's maybe, not the answer that people want to hear because it's complicated. How do you figure out how to, connect people to just taking what they need and really having it be about healing? So that's one thing I can't help mention. It's really, really important. Um, even Wachuma, we're learning, which is this incredibly sturdy, unbelievable, plant that you can actually grow almost anywhere. but there's many, many varieties in the highlands of Peru. And there are whole valleys that have certain strains that are now they're almost gone because of the Wachuma kind of tourism trade. So I'm not saying this is easy, but I think we have to figure out ways of connecting people to these really deeply healing medicine experiences without doing more destruction. So, anyways, maybe ask your question again, because
No, what I was reflecting on is two things. The first thing is that I noticed you got fired up as soon as I asked the question. So there's some energy that's stirred in there. And the second thing is I was back at your comment about manners, and these are powerfully seductive experiences, and I don't blame anybody who wants to have an experience and that wants to return to that experience. But in part, I think that what we're looking at is that ego, the egoic grasp that we inherently do as humans, we need some kind of guide rails in place to provide us an opportunity to channel those tendencies that we inevitably are confronted with, that I think religious traditions have certainly mapped out for us in our histories. But now religious tradition, back to my kind of previous argument, is that because we're we Westerners are unhooked from the initial ecstatic experience, the core religious event, and then figuring out how we relate to that event, both individually and collectively, that to me is a pretty decent definition of what religion is. And I don't think you're going to find that definition in many public spaces in modernity.
Well, I like that definition very much. And what it brings up for me is another thing that I've heard and thought about a lot is, I really had to deeply explore this during the time when I ended up kind of getting in some conflict with Decrim Nature, because Decrim Nature was this movement that was about cognitive liberty and the right to nature. And so I really spent a lot of time sitting with that, like the right to nature. And some of the indigenous folks and other religious folks I've talked to, it's like, is it a right or is it a responsibility? Yeah. When something's really powerful and you get to work with it, that actually, like, when did that become a right? Why isn't that a responsibility? And then that completely shifts the whole way to think about it. And, what if it was considered a real responsibility to take on, like, sharing these really powerful consciousness medicines with people who are really hurting and longing for more connection? And obviously addiction is really complex, and there's, I'm not trying to simplify it, but if we just turned it around and said, wow, these are really powerful, these things have the power to help us feel reconnected, or at least set us on a path of knowing of having a feeling of being, connected, whether that's being disconnected from our ego or whatever. And that it's an incredible responsibility to then know how to navigate doing life with that. And what if we just, took that on as a frame as opposed to a right? And then I think that in a certain way addresses that taking aspect to it, which, when you're hurting, right? Of course, when you're hurting, you just want to grasp at things, right? Totally. And get the thing that you need. And so I feel like this piece is a big part of it, culturally, is, when I'm hurting, how do I find somebody or find in myself, the capacity to take responsibility for doing something really major and sacred, and that changes my perception and my consciousness and reconnects me with my own lineage or with the divine in general or whatever that way is. And we don't have a right to that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there's a responsibility that comes along with those things, those moments.
I don't mean to be critical of the right the right mentality, the that mentality you're talking about. But it does
Mm.
seem a little immature in that it to 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 me it actually is exactly what I've learned about in the Genesis story, where there's a mistranslation between stewardship or husbandry is the term versus dominion, and the enormous mistranslation that contributes to this idea that I have dominion over nature as opposed to I'm in right relationship to be involved in the husbandry of the ecology of the world that I'm in. and
Mm-hmm.
and those kinds of unfortunate mistranslations are part of what I have to recognize is in me as a human that has a greedy part of me, a hateful part of me, a self-serving part of me. And that's my responsibility, is to recognize that all those forces are within me and I have to continually contend with how they show up in my life and how they affect other people. So I'm with you. I guess I really align with that curiosity that you have around the right versus responsibility.
Well, and I think one of the big challenges right now is how do we, within the psychedelic boom, in order for it to really benefit, so many people in our communities, how do we get some structures in
Yeah,
place, some norms in place that support us the same way you were talking about religion is supposed to
that's right.
support us to not have our decision making and what we're creating right now be driven by that, like the greed part or the like
Mm-hmm.
I have the right part or the and I think that's one of the big challenges is how do we have structures in place which help us because
Yeah.
we're all kind of immature and we all want everything right now and
Yes.
we all get pissed at people and the number of like interpersonal relations that get in the way of like doing the good work and blah 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 blah
Yeah.
blah. But so what are those right now? I think is one of the biggest challenges. I think for us at RiverStyx, I think clearly this religious leaders piece, whether it's the Western
Mm.
religious leaders, the traditional indigenous spiritual leadership, really getting supported to be their best and have everything they need to do their work
Mm-hmm.
well, seems like a high leverage place. But I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the business models and the access models and the popular knowledge about how to have good containers that help you to prepare and integrate and take responsibility. So but I think that is a lot of it is, yeah, what are the, I mean, I have a big inquiry around it. And my more cynical side is like, probably not. It's just going to be like mayhem and, some good things will happen and some messes will be made and here we go, whatever. But I'm, I really try to stay in this place of like, yeah, what are some of those structures that will really support the unfolding being about taking responsibility and reconnection
Mm-hmm.
to ourselves, who we are, and yeah.
This thought comes up, and I want to be mindful of time. So as we start to kind of,
Mm,
merge through our closing, um, this, and again, not to be cynical, because I think going to a concert and having a radical experience with the collective and everybody singing one voice to the music and moving together and while taking some kind of substance sounds fantastic on a lot of levels. It sounds concerning about what you might open up because it's so unpredictable, the environment, but When you talk about psychedelics, for a long, long time, people have been taking LSD and going to concerts and having radically healing, beautiful experiences. So, with that said, what I hear in more indigenous traditional communities is that the orientation is not just on the ecstatic experience. It's how you take what you experience in the ecstatic experience and merge that into your mundane life, and so that it's part of your daily living, that you're exploring and bringing in what you experience so that you live a different life. And that's where we get into this conversation about integration and the importance of having a cultural process by which somebody can orient themselves in that, in how they're bringing the fruits of their labor to benefit the collective. Joseph Campbell talked a lot about this, of course, that it's like when you go to the underworld, what's the elixir that you bring back to contribute to the whole? And I don't think that a lot of folks, a lot of the majority of people don't think in terms of taking LSD, for example, and having an experience to then change your life. I think, at least my projection is, they're having the experience to have the experience. And that's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And that's magical on a lot of levels, but it's just not complete. And I think that's one of the things that this ecological model really gets, which is that interconnection between the sacred and the profane or mundane,
Mm-hmm.
and how to bring those
Mm-hmm.
to be in more healthy relationship than just I go there, maybe to church or my sacred place or my sacred ceremony on Friday or Sunday or whatever day, and then I have it there, versus bringing it here. So I just to reflect on that, I think that's an important part of the process. Anything come up for you as I say that?
Yeah, you reminded me of I had the good fortune of getting to work doing outdoor training with folks for almost 20 years. It's how I put myself through graduate school. And the way we would talk about it is you can have a peak experience, like say
Yeah.
you climb up a tree and you bend down and you're going to jump off of it. We've all heard of these like ropes courses or whatever, and there actually is a change that happens in that moment. It's a peak experience. You're different in that moment than you were, 10 minutes before.
Yeah.
And those peak experiences are extremely important. You can actually change in them, but then the work of them comes afterwards, of as you go back down from that peak experience, how are you bringing that change forward
Yeah.
and allowing it to last for more than 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever. And I think that is really, really important, is how do our peak experiences actually integrate into creating meaning in our daily life, giving us tools to address, the ups and downs of like our mental health. How do they actually impact how we engage in relationship with, the rest of the world. And I think that is a big, important, focus point. And if we don't integrate some of those experiences, then we're not really utilizing the incredible, power,
Yeah.
and taking responsibility
Yeah.
for what is available to us through these kind of medicines.
That's really one of the great themes I'm taking from our conversation about, we hear about this a lot, but in this context, it resonates differently. The personal responsibility of being in right relationship with your body, your mind, your, relationships to the land, where you are, who you are in your
Mm,
culture, and owning that responsibility is something that's empowering. Um,
mm.
but
Wear your
again,
medicine.
yeah,
Mm,
again, as you were talking about uh, medicines, I was thinking about the typical Friday night at the bar, and somebody goes out and gets drunk and they have an experience, and then it's forgotten. It may have been fun and joyful, but it's not really it's not integratable. It's not,
Yeah.
you know. So it reminds me of this thing Mark Plotkin said to me a long time ago, where he says that he was talking to a shaman down in South America, and the shaman says, your drugs make you feel better and then worse. Our drugs make us feel worse and then better. And I think that summarizes it all so well.
That is a good summary.
Yeah.
I like
Well,
that.
so
That's,
I am. Do you feel? I'd love to give you an opportunity to fill in any blanks about these funds and the nonprofits that you work for. Is there anything we're leaving out there? I certainly want you to point people in that direction. I will have
hmm.
links all over the place, but anything that you'd like to say in closing about those spaces?
Hmm. Well, I mean, I'll say again that I have a really grand, idealistic, but I think very pragmatic hope that the psychedelic boom, both the people individually, the organizations, the funders, the companies, all of that will deeply attend to ensuring that we're in right relationship with Indigenous traditional knowledge holders as we go into more systematizing this boom, because I just know that in 50 years from now, if we can look back and say not only did we address massive amounts of mental health concerns and reconnection, and people's lives are deeply better, from how they feel to how they make decisions, and we did that without harming
Mm.
traditional knowledge holders who have these incredibly precious cultural containers for how they work with medicines and their territories. It's just going to feel so good. It's just going to be so I really think it's one of the solutions to having a positive experience that doesn't turn colonial.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. Well, anything else at all? Any thread we've left dangling out there?
No, just thank you very much. This was actually a really enjoyable conversation for me, and it isn't that common that I get to be transparent about that. I see a deep connection between what we do with our poo and our bodies to how we navigate the psychedelic boom. So I'm very grateful.
Miriam, I'm so happy to provide you the opportunity to connect shit and medicine space and ecology and food. Really, thank you. You're I, I a gift in this process for me is that as the editor of these podcasts, I get to listen back, and I'm eager to reconnect with all the things we've said today. So thank you for what you do in this space. I mean, I'm certainly a beneficiary for what RiverStyx is doing and in all your work. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful that you're out there on the front lines doing what you're doing, and that we get to benefit from such a healthy, ecologically minded, relationally connected approach. That your term, I love this term, extractive. I'm going to be using extractive a lot because it really does image the harm um, of that approach, of that extractive approach. So thank you for this and for doing what you do.
Okay. Thank you, John.